Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award winning Compliance into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
And I thought we hadn't done a potpourri episode in a bit, and we've got several things that I know you've been writing about and thinking about. What have you been writing about and thinking about?
Oh, we have a lot. I have potpourri of issues within a potpourri of posts. We could talk about Paul Atkins, the newly named chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission once Donald Trump arrives in office on January 20th. Atkins was a Republican commissioner back in the 2000s, and now he is going to be chairman sometime this spring. We could talk about the multiple issues where I think he could have some significant bearing on compliance and audit professionals' lives. We could talk about a rather interesting speech given last week where the chief counsel for the criminal division of the Justice Department was talking about FCPA settlements and hinted at the possibility of basically an early release program for some companies that are already under DPAs or NPAs for anti-corruption settlements, not for anybody in the future, I don't think, but we can talk about what that is. And then, of course, there was the McKinsey settlement where McKinsey's South Africa business paid, I think it was $122.8 million to settle FCPA charges from South Africa corruption in the 2010s. I will admit I have not been fully briefed yet on what's going on with McKinsey's Africa settlement, but we got all of that and probably more that I can't even remember. But there's a lot going on.
Why don't we start with the Securities and Exchange Commission and Paul Atkins, maybe with your perhaps initial assessments of the selection?
Sure. Atkins, as I said, he was a Republican commissioner from 2002 to 2008. So that was a while ago. Since then, he has run his own consulting firm for financial services firms called Potomac Partners. He spells Potomac with a K instead of a C at the end. I'm not quite sure what that's about. And then on top of that, Atkins has a reputation. He is clearly going to be a quite conservative chairman. He has stated his views quite clearly over the years about a wide range of issues. Although, Tom, I have to admit, Atkins is not a unreasonable nominee for a Republican administration. A lot of people will disagree with his politics and his views on policy issues and capital markets, but Atkins cares about the commission. He worked at the commission in the 90s under several other chairmen as a staffer. He served through three chairmen in the 2000s when he was a commissioner, and he knows what he's doing. So even if you don't necessarily like what he is doing, at least he knows how to do it, which is certainly a cut above what we can say for other Donald Trump nominees, such as Kash Patel running the FBI or Pete Hegseth nominated to be defense secretary. Those people have no clue what they're doing, absolutely not qualified to run the agencies they've been tapped to lead. Atkins is not that. Atkins is an establishment candidate. He is a conservative establishment candidate, but he's somebody that you can at least tolerate. He cares about the success of the agency, and I think that's an important point to call out.
So, any thoughts or maybe initial assessments might be the better phrase of things he might change or directions he might go?
I had a couple of questions that I would recommend compliance officers think about. First off, I do wonder how much time is he going to spend talking about cryptocurrency policy? And I get it that most compliance officers, unless you are directly working at a crypto firm, you don't really care much about crypto. Other than those crypto compliance people at the next generation of fintechs coming along, I have never really had a substantive conversation about crypto with other ethics and compliance people at non-financial companies. However, it seems like this is all Republicans want to talk about on financial policy. So right away, one question I have, is this all we're going to talk about with financial policy? There's other stuff that is more relevant to more people. However, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Paul Atkins, and the Republicans on the Financial Services Committee in the House, certainly, and also on the Senate Banking Committee, they seem to care an awful lot about crypto because their financial backers care a lot about crypto. Are we going to wind up having crypto conversations suck up all the oxygen in the room, which would be a shame because we do have other issues that I think compliance officers, it's more important to you. Tom, the second one I think we could talk about, probably a whole other podcast some other day. How is Atkins going to be thinking about monetary penalties in corporate enforcement? Because when he was last a commissioner at the SEC in the mid 2000s, Atkins was a very vocal proponent of the theory that monetary penalties in financial fraud cases, they don't really serve much purpose. If it's a financial fraud, that means an unscrupulous CFO or controller or CEO, they already screwed over the shareholders by committing accounting fraud. And so now the regulator is going to screw over the shareholders again by fining the company because that's money that the shareholders, as owners of the company, they don't get it. So Atkins was basically one who said that for corporate financial penalties don't make any sense. They serve no purpose except to harm shareholders who've already been harmed. Tom, my big issue here is that might have been true in the enforcement world of 2005 ish when Atkins was last around. And we have an utterly different corporate enforcement world now. And I'm curious, how will he think of corporate penalties in today's world? I will even grant that maybe in accounting fraud cases, that theory that financial penalties against a company only harm shareholders, maybe that's true. However, FCPA cases really weren't a thing 20 years ago when Atkins was last there, and now they are a thing, and they're a big part of SEC enforcement, and they're not like accounting fraud cases. Shareholders don't suffer in an FCPA enforcement action. Company discloses it, the share price might fluctuate for half a point for 3 days, and then it goes right back up. So corporate monetary penalties, I could make an argument that they make a lot of sense for FCPA enforcement. What does Atkins think about that? Because FCPA enforcement wasn't really a thing the last time he was in charge, or he wasn't even in charge, but the last time he was around. I could say the same for cybersecurity enforcement, that Atkins left the SEC in 2008. That was before the SEC even had any guidance about cybersecurity, because that guidance didn't even start to come along until 2011. The latest guidelines are they're not onerous rules for required disclosure, but they were adopted in 2023. Those rules are not fun either, but how is Atkins going to take his 2000s mindset and apply it to a 2024 world where cybersecurity disclosures are a big thing? Failure of cybersecurity can be a big thing for investors. How are we enforcing audits of IT general controls, which again, they weren't not a thing 20 years ago, but they weren't nearly as important as they are today. There's a lot of stuff like that, Tom, that we don't know how Atkins will take his previous enforcement experience and policy experience from 2 decades ago, and will he update that for 2020's issues? Will he stick with it? Will we see less requirements for disclosure? I mean, in some instances, yes, we'll see less burdens for ESG disclosure, climate change emissions disclosure. That's not going to happen under Atkins. And then, Tom, I think the final thing that I had was I'm curious how Atkins will handle the PCAOB, which is the regulator that governs audit firms. And it is currently run by a very zealous and competent chairman, Erica Williams, who drives the audit world crazy. And she also drives a lot of Republicans crazy. I don't necessarily think that her actions are unwarranted. Audits are they're a big, messy thing, and there's a lot of weakness and a lot of corporate audits. However, she was just reappointed to a new term. She should be in office until 2029. I can't believe that Atkins or Donald Trump will actually allow her to stay there. So are they going to fire her? If they do, or what are they going to do with the PCAOB? There is a movement afoot, this comes up every couple of years, to eliminate the PCAOB entirely and subsume it into a division of audit enforcement or something like that within the SEC. I think Atkins would love to do that. Requires an act of Congress to get it done. I don't know that would happen. But we could talk through a whole bunch of issues like that. There's a lot of practical ways that Atkins might slow or constrain SEC investigation techniques that might have bearing on FCPA or internal control issues and cases. There's all sorts of ways that he could be a profound commissioner and really drive SEC policy toward the conservative end. And that will have implications for compliance teams.
Let me go to your point two, enforcement, because Bruce Carton today in his securities docket newsletter cited to an article by John Reed Stark about a paper that Atkins wrote in, I think, 2007 or 2008, where he laid out a lot of the issues you raised and a couple of others that might address some of those. And the one that struck me was he was a very profound advocate for greater individual sanctions and penalties and SEC enforcement. Now, he properly noted that at that time frame, we didn't have as robust enforcement and some of the others we have today. But one of the answers might be to have more increased individual enforcement, recognizing that you're not going to get 20, 50, or $100 million out of an individual, might get 50,000 or 100,000, but we may have more individual enforcement and both. We could certainly have that in FCPA cases from the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is not typically something we have seen. We could see an increase in individual enforcement. His arguments against the corporate penalties, he also found or seems to indicate that has become the measuring stick or metric that the SEC wants to use when they go in front of Congress for more money. So once that stick gets put in place with that metric, it's sometimes hard to turn back. PCAOB could be interesting, but for the compliance community, Matt, I think we'll probably look at the end of NOCLAR, which would have
Yep.
been the biggest change. And I'm going to be interested in the cybersecurity, particularly with the dismissal of the lawsuit against the CISO of SolarWinds. Our colleague Karen Woody had some thoughts about internal controls and cybersecurity that may get rethought during this prior administration. But I'm going to be interested to see if they think that cybersecurity disclosures should continue to be as prominent as the prior SEC administration thought.
Well, a couple of things. I do think that the most interesting challenge here will probably be cybersecurity because we really, it is obvious that poor cybersecurity can lead to enormous disruption and financial losses. For who? For everybody, for investors, for consumers, for all sorts of people. And we don't really have any regulatory structure right now to hold companies accountable for keeping your cybersecurity act together. Let's say Atkins wants individual enforcement for internal control failures. Okay, I'm with that. But the biggest, most expensive cybersecurity failure of this year is probably going to be the United Health breach that happened back in March, which has cost United about $2 billion this year. Clearly material to investors, clearly caused enormous disruption, and will, I think, lead to other regulatory penalties from other agencies. But that was caused by somebody somewhere failing to implement multi-factor authentication on a critical server in a subsidiary that United had acquired. So if we want individual accountability, who's the SEC supposed to go on after in that? I mean, are we really going to go after Bob, the IT guy who spaced out one day and forgot to patch a server somewhere? I don't necessarily know that's fair. How much restitution are you going to be able to get from Bob? Because he's probably not that wealthy of a person, but investors suffered. The United Health had made public statements to investors and everybody else that we have strong cybersecurity, and yet you didn't because you had personal healthcare information for sale on the dark web after this happened. You had huge numbers of people whose medical procedures and routines were disrupted because of a routine failure. So how do we enforce against that? But I'm with the federal judiciary who has said you can't use internal accounting controls, first adopted in the Ford administration, to enforce poor cybersecurity, which is not an SEC thing. They're investor protection, not a cybersecurity agency. So there are points on both sides here, but that points back to what I said before. The world has changed from when Atkins was last at the SEC. And I don't know how easily some of his Bush era views translate into a 2020s landscape. And Tom, but the other thing that I would think about going back to enforcement, Because I had also read that post from John Reed Stark, which is out on Twitter and it's worth reading. Atkins could do things like decline to subpoena any sort of personal, so like an internet service provider for personal data of a fraudster absent a court order. That he might change SEC enforcement policy. We won't use just a subpoena. We need to get a court order. That's harder. Or he might do something like, say, if the Justice Department didn't bring any criminal action against a company for an FCPA violation or against an individual, if DOJ thinks there's no crime, then we shouldn't bring an enforcement action either. I think that's bogus because DOJ just said there's no prosecutable crime we can successfully win, but the SEC doesn't operate on that standard. But if justice isn't holding anybody individually accountable for an FCPA violation, would an Atkins led SEC hang their hat on? So then we're not going to do anything either. Or if they're not going to pursue private data, because that's how these internal control violations happen now, they set up the bribery scheme on Gmail. How are you going to get that data? And Tom, the other big thing that I hadn't really thought of until right now, but the thing that didn't exist when Atkins was last at the SEC is the office of the whistleblower. How is he going to view the office of the whistleblower, the flood of tips that people get now, or the SEC gets from people who want to see something done? That is a rich resource for potential FCPA enforcement or accounting fraud enforcement or insider trading enforcement. But what's Atkins going to do with it? Because this was not a thing that existed. The whistleblower office did not come into existence at the SEC until 2011 after he'd long gone. So he might be able to say that we're going to still take whistleblower tips, that would let him, I don't know, maybe do something more, encourage voluntary self-disclosure for a company, and then we won't give you penalties. But if you don't forget, we have these zillion whistleblower tips and you might be in there and then we can chase you and then you would face penalties. Like, these are the scenarios that we have no idea how Atkins might actually think about them in practice yet, but they could have enormous implication for how compliance officers actually work every day.
Let me pick up on that last point, and then I have another one that came to mind a little bit early in our conversation as well. On the whistleblower hotline, office of the whistleblower, we saw Jay Clayton attempt to essentially eviscerate the whistleblower practice during his tenure in the first Trump administration by cutting out large awards. And there was a revolt by that bar and others, including Chuck Grassley, against that. We were never I don't think we were able to determine who was the constituency that wanted to do that. And all I could conclude, it was corporations who didn't want tips sent in, and they thought if they didn't SEC didn't incentivize people, they wouldn't send tips in. Maybe that's not right, but if he wanted to go in that direction, he has a lock majority of Republican commissioners, 2 of which who actually worked for him, the 2 Republican commissioners. So
Yes.
they could change that if they want. Do you even sense that as a possibility? Or as you said, since nothing like this existed, we really have no way to assess his views on that issue?
I mean, first off, we have no way to assess his views on that issue. That is correct. Second, it is a good point, actually, that the 2 current Republican commissioners, Hester Peirce and Mark Udea, they were both counsels to Paul Atkins when he was commissioner 20 years ago. So they do have their own little tripart club now who know quite well how to work together. So they will be able to get a lot done if they so choose. Tom, not that I want to open up another whole bucket of weeds here, but I guess we should, is that under Gary Gensler, they did formalize a new rule for whistleblower bounties that gave the commission more discretion to give bigger awards. But the point is, it's a rule. So if Atkins wants to change that, he must adopt a new rule. Now he can, he's got the majority, he can put it through. But thank you, Supreme Court. The one thing that they did to make regulatory life more miserable than it already was this year, they made it easier for anybody to sue any agency over any new rule that it adopts. In fact, also a lot of old rules. My first question would be, if Atkins does try to pass a rule, which he'd have to do to rescind the old rule, that's going to get challenged in court by the whistleblower bar again. You bring it in front of the right judge, is going to make up his own rule because we repealed the Chevron doctrine. So there's a big mess here. that it's going to be really easy to say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this and this. And then everybody else is going to say, no, I'm going to litigate you on that and that. And it's going to be tied up in court until who knows when. I don't have any clear answer for that. I do think where the rubber meets the road and where Atkins could do a lot without getting things dragged into an Administrative Procedures Act hearing is on enforcement. He could just change how the SEC internal offices and attorneys bring about enforcement cases and make it more corporation friendly, such as we will not seek outside information with just a subpoena. We're only going to get a court order out of respect for a potential fraudster or target's privacy or something like that's how he could actually get things done sooner rather than later. He could make a whole lot of administrative kerfluffle, but there's going to be a whole lot of counter kerfluffle to push back against that, which leads to more chaos and uncertainty, which I do think is going to be the byword for the Trump administration in all sorts of ways. And this is just one of the ways.
Let me raise a second point, and you mentioned Commissioner Pierce, Hester Pierce, and she had advocated for some type of statement by the SEC or more formalization of protection for chief compliance officers. That's been a debate for some time. Should there be formal rules beyond what exists now? I believe the New York City bar, or at least the New York bar, has proposed protections for compliance officers. Do you think there might be any movement on that area?
That's a good question. And we should be clear that there are two types of compliance officers we're talking about here, and that Commissioner Peirce has mostly focused on chief compliance officers at investment companies subject to the Investment Advisors Act, where there are various rules that maybe a chief compliance officer could be held liable for a compliance failure that is through no fault of their own. But these are investment companies. These are not chief compliance officers at a non financial big business operating company. You people, which is most compliance officers who listen to this podcast, you would not be subject to that sort of protection. You would still be left out in the weeds. Now, I personally would love to see the SEC adopt a rule for all those other compliance officers too. In the non-financial world, the firing or departure of a chief compliance officer might be an 8K triggering event, or there might be some sort of noisy withdrawal if the compliance officer sees that there is trouble coming. The CEO wants to bury it under the rug. I'm going to quit. And the prospects of disclosing that, like you'd have to disclose the chief accounting officer quitting, I think that would give a lot of companies pause. It's a fight that they probably don't want to have. This is also a very good idea that I think is not going to come to pass with the Republican administration. I might be wrong. Maybe Commissioner Peirce would expand who she thinks of as compliance officers and also give non-financial company CCOs some extra protection too. I do think that giving CCOs at financial companies, investment companies, some extra protections, sure, that'll help. It wouldn't hurt. However, the number of chief compliance officers at investment companies who are suffering SEC enforcement for some program failure beyond their control, that is a vanishingly small number. Most CCOs who wind up on the wrong side of regulators, either you're in on it, whatever it was, or you were so grossly negligent that you really deserve sanction anyways. The number of people who are trying to do the right thing and the company steamrolls over them and then the SEC targets you anyways as a scapegoat, that's somewhere between 0 and 0. It is a solution in search of a problem, in my humble opinion, but it's not a bad solution.
The reason I would be interested in Commissioner Pierce's thoughts or the SEC formalizing a rule is I think that would lend a debate to the non-regulated industries, and it might become some sort of, if not anecdotal, precedental, precedential, precedental, something of value that we could look at in other situations. But I agree that the enforcement is somewhere between 0 and 0 for those who deserve it.
Yeah.
Wow, 25 minutes on that topic. You want to try to talk about Wibble in a few minutes, or you want to hold that for another pod?
I'll give it the quick rundown. So this was Chief Counsel Wibble. Let me make sure that I have his correct name. I think it was Brent Wibble. So Brent Whipple spoke at the ACI FCPA conference last week, I believe it was, where he was talking about encouraging companies to come forward and self-disclose their FCPA violations. And then he said that prosecutors in the criminal division are thinking about how to give some sort of early exit to companies that had tried to make self disclosure, but somehow failed to actually win self disclosure credit, such as your company called the DOJ to say, we want to come in and talk. And before you could show up the following week, news broke out that you had an FCPA violation. It was in the press, and now you've lost voluntary self disclosure because everybody knows it. That actually happened. That was ABB. That I think it happened in 2022. So Mr. Wibble basically said that they are at least considering early release for companies that had tried to do the right thing, had tried to voluntarily self disclose, missed it, but still did outstanding cooperation, outstanding remediation. They are still under a 3-year DPA of some kind. Maybe they should get early release. We don't know when that will come to pass. We don't know if that will come to pass. My reading of his words is that it will not extend to future settlements where you're not going to get out on some sort of early parole or good behavior from here forward. It's more that everybody already knows what you should do from here forward. These other companies had tried, they messed it up, and they've been really great anyways. So give them some early release. Very intriguing idea. I don't know if it will come to pass. We only have another 6 weeks left before the Trump administration takes over anyway, but it's an interesting idea in FCPA.
I really think it is too. I characterized it earlier today as a massage, not a policy change. And it would seem to me that what they're trying to encourage is really an extraordinary level of cooperation and an extraordinary level of remediation. We have had a couple of cases where either the DPA specifically said they got a DPA because they hadn't finished their testing, or a monitor was put in place for that reason. And if a company has incentive to speed that process up, that might be something that would be, I think, good for the company and good for enforcement going forward.
I agree with that. And I'll only close by saying it's a very interesting idea. And I do wonder how Trump administration DOJ officials will think about it, take it, run with it. They might run with it off in some other weird direction that is not very pro enforcement. I don't know. But I mean, they've waving that flag around at least right now. They haven't planted it yet, but they might plant it before January 20th. And what will future Justice Department people do with that flag once it's flapping in the breeze? That is a good question to consider.
We started off by speaking about McKinsey, and we'll probably have to save that for another pod. But we had, I would say, a relatively major FCPA enforcement action involving McKinsey in South Africa. You want to just highlight that?
You hit all of the highlights. I have not had a chance yet to dive into it too much. I do know that it was a $122 million criminal penalty. McKinsey's not publicly traded. There is no SEC enforcement action here, but it did involve a state-owned energy company, Exxon, which I think has been involved in pretty much every corrupt act in South Africa in the last 15 years. It is notorious. And also the local state-owned ports company, and of course, South Africa, highly corrupt anyways. So no surprise, but they did wind up cooperating with the Justice Department to bring an enforcement action against an individual ex-manager at McKinsey who was very much involved in this corruption, who's now facing personal FCPA prosecution as well. We'll have to talk about it more some other day, but the FCPA wheels of justice continue to turn.
Seems like a great way to end this podcast, Matt.
Thanks, Tom.